Hello, I'm Elian Saint-Hilaire, and in this video we're going to take a look at the history of MeshCentral. This will be the first of a series that's more technical and dives into the details of how MeshCentral is built. Let's take a look at that right now. So MeshCentral has had a long history, much longer than most people know. So first there was like the agent-only version, then there was a ASP.NET version, and then there's the version that is used today, which is the Node.js, Express.js, JavaScript version that is widely popular and available on NPM. But I want to take a look at the entire history of MeshCentral and take a look at how I went from the older versions to the new version and what happened in between. So let's take a look at that. And I'm going to bring up a set of slides here, very basic slides. And we are going to start with basically what I'll call here MeshCentral version 0, and just describe the initial idea. And this is probably almost 15 years ago. So this is a long, long time ago. And so basically there was this thing called Intel Active Management Technology, AMT, and it's hardware-based agents. I wanted to supplement this with software-based agents. And usually what happened is that people would have a central server that manages all the devices. I wanted to have a way of doing distributed management of devices. So I wanted to install some kind of agent on each machine that would collect information, hook up to peers. It would balance a graph of peers using a technology that's similar to distributed hash tables that's used in BitTorrent and other technologies, so that each agent would have a set of friends around it, but it could convey messages to any message to any computer on the broader network. So it was basically a on-prem or a LAN technology where you would have hundreds of computers speaking on a local area network. And then they would have a whole bunch of cryptography, which I won't get into. But then if you had the right authentication certificate, you could use special tools to find one of the agents. And then through this agent, you could find all the other agents. You could log in. You can then connect to any of the agents and do remote terminal, remote files, and remote desktop. So kind of similar to what we have today, the usages, but they were all done without a central server and all on a local network. So that was the original idea. The agent was built, the first prototype that lasted only a few months were built in C#, but because the agent needed to be in portable, cross-platform, then the agent was rapidly built in C. And so basically the third version of the agent that I built was in C code, and that's the one that a lot of the original code from that era is still in the Mesh agent today in C. So that was the original idea. Then, of course, the web was very present even at the time. Now, at the time that we go to start designing MeshCentral 1, we have, I believe, IIS 6. We don't have WebSockets. We don't have HTML5. So this is kind of the beginnings of the web. There was Mozilla still there. And so the next logical thing for these agents that are talking in peer-to-peer was, well, what if I have multiple groups of agents in different sites? I want to have a central server that's web-based, and I want to be able to manage all these devices through a web-based interface. And it became very clear that, Gmail basically just started at the time. I think it was still like invitation only when the code for the original agent was built on-prem, and it made sense that then if you had Gmail where you could manage your email online, you could also manage your computers online. Now, so what happened is that in addition to using tools on the local network, you could also have a server, and the server was actually optional. Like, you didn't need the server, so both models were still supported. And the agents could be configured to communicate to the server, and then you would, as a user, log into the server, have a web page, and so on. So that was kind of the way it went. The interesting thing about the version 1 agents is that if you look at the code, it really was meant to support both on-prem through direct tools and over the internet, over the internet to the central server. So you had things like, for example, when the server wanted to initiate a remote session to an agent, it would basically do a TLS inside this tunnel and then access the same port that the local tools would use. So it was very interesting because the agent would listen to a port on the local network for inbound connections for, remote desktop and so on. And the server would basically use this port relay system to hit the same port. And so the server would look like a local tool to the agent. So weird technology, obviously, that did not age too well. So after a while, I became, I kind of understood that this was not well adapted to the modern world. And also what happened is that more and more this on-prem wasn't that useful anymore. Everything was moving to the cloud, and all the legacy code that was being used to support on-prem was really not necessary anymore and wasn't used. It was more of a burden. So then comes MeshCentral 2, and the design goes much simpler now. It's the design we know today, where the agents are installed, they connect to the server, and the user connects to the server, and that's it. By the way, the origin of the name is interesting too, because obviously in the first instance where the agents would form a mesh of agents together, that was like the mesh of agents. And then when it came time to build the central server, well, what would it would basically be the center of the mesh, where you would have your meshes or your groups of devices here that would talk to each other, and then this would be the center of these meshes. So that's where the name came from. So move now to MeshCentral version 2. This is, I personally don't use V2 anymore. I just say MeshCentral because all the other versions don't exist anymore. They're not supported and the code is gone. But so I just call it MeshCentral, but occasionally you'll see me refer to it as MeshCentral version 2, V2, but that's the one that everybody uses today. Okay, so a quick recap of the old technology of MeshCentral version 1 versus version 2, and what I learned at the time and how I used that learnings to basically figure out how to design a better version in version 2. So version 1 had the agent built in portable C code. You had the server built on IIS, ASP.NET, and C#. So, that was kind of what was available on my desktop at the time where I wanted to build this. I was running a Windows system, so that was kind of the logical thing to do. And then the web applications were running, obviously, JavaScript in the browser. Then you had Microsoft SQL as the database at the time with the database schema, and it ran this language called TSQL, which is like for stored procedures and processing data inside the database. So as I started building version 1 of the MeshCentral server, you ended up having to learn and use in the same day C code, C# code, JavaScript code, and TSQL code. And so you had to know 4 programming languages in order to code a lot of the usages that you wanted to code. Also, the agent was built in C. And so if you're building C code, the easiest way to pack data and send it to the server was to do structs in C. So basically the agent would talk to the server in a fully binary protocol where you had command ID, command length, and binary data. And so back and forth like that, and the C# code would basically grab the binary data, split up the binary data, of course, on the TCP stream or the TLS stream. It would then decode it, parse it, and run it. And then you go back and forth like that. And what happened is that the web app would basically do a lot of that binary also. So the web app would pack binary data, send it over to the server, and back and forth like that. So that was the way it went. The original server did, because WebSockets didn't exist yet, the original server did HTTP polling for real-time communication. So basically, the web app would launch an HTTP connection, and then the server would hold that connection until there was data that came in, and then it would send that data and then pile up more data so that when the web application would send the next HTTP request, it would grab the next block of data from the server and so on and so forth. So that was super tricky, super bizarre. And so IIS 6 did not support WebSockets, so you had to kind of do that. Then, of course, you had TSQL, so you had to build a schema. Every time you updated the server, you needed to change, the tables in SQL and so on. So you had, like, every time you need to make some change to the database or the server, it was always breaking stuff. So updating a previous version of MeshCentral 1 to a next version of MeshCentral 1 was really, really difficult. So anyway, all that works, but it's a lot of complexity to code. So then at some point I'm like, okay, we got to go to the next version, MeshCentral 2. We got to ditch all the legacy code. And so MeshCentral 2 has a very different architecture. The agent is still built in portable C code, but now it runs duct tape, which is a JavaScript runtime. And so now the agent is capable of running JavaScript. The server is now built in Node.js, and it uses the database, it uses the web server Express.js that is well known, kind of the standard for Node.js. And of course, it's built in JavaScript. And then the web app is, of course, running JavaScript. So now what we have is a much simpler design where, except for this part of C code here that hopefully doesn't change too much because most of the smarts is done in JavaScript anyway, what happens is that the agent is mostly JavaScript, the server is all JavaScript, and the web app is all JavaScript. So now you need one single programming language, and you can share code, and you now have all your components built in one programming language. It's just so much easier. The other thing is, with MongoDB, you don't have stored procedures in it, and the database is schemaless, so it's very easy to tweak and add values and so on, and keep updating the server. You don't have to constantly have to change tables on the database and things like that. So a lot simpler to code. And of course, I love JavaScript in general. It allows you to code very, very quickly. The other nice thing is that because you're running JavaScript all over the place, while JavaScript serializes, of course, its favorite format is JSON, and so now you're using JSON to communicate between the agent and the server. You're having JSON between the web app and the server, and you're storing JSON documents to the MongoDB database. So everything now is JSON, no more binary data. And also, because it's JSON, it's super easy to tweak things. If you want to add a new value, you want to remove a value, the parsing is super easy. One of the things that was really annoying in MeshCentral 1 is that you had a lot of code in C code or in C# code and so on to serialize and unserialize the binary blocks. Now, you just type json.serialize or json.parse, and you got yourself all the serialization and deserialization immediately in one line of code. So made everything super simple. Let's see. The other thing I want to do, this is the last slide, and I would just want to cover just other broad benefits of switching from the MeshCentral 1 instance or legacy code to the new one. Well, obviously, I talked about the old one. It was built in IIS, ASP.NET, and Microsoft SQL. The new one, Express.js, Node.js, and MongoDB. And the switch had a few big impact on MeshCentral. One is that you don't need to license any commercial software anymore. The entire MeshCentral 2 stack is built on open source software. It is open source itself, so you really have a completely free solution that you can use, and it's completely open. The other one is that if you look at Windows running, these technologies, well, that required a much bigger server. So typically you would have like $1,000 a month hosting costs for any reasonably sized MeshCentral instance, where the new instance, the new stack runs on a Raspberry Pi, runs on a tiny server, and with $35, $50 a month, you can run 20,000 to 100,000 machines on an instance. So the efficiency has gone up significantly, and the cost of hosting has gone down significantly with switching from this old stack to this new stack. Another thing I mentioned is all the different programming languages. It was very tricky to switch between all of them. Now, there's a core part of the agent that's C, but mostly all of the smarts of MeshCentral is now all in JavaScript. Makes everything super, super easy. MeshCentral 1 only supported WAN mode, so you had to set it up in the cloud. If you could set it up on-prem, but it really didn't work very well. And it was basically WAN mode on-prem. Now, MeshCentral 2 has LAN, WAN, and hybrid modes. If you listen to other videos I've made, in LAN mode, you can set up the server without a fixed IP address, and all the computers will multicast to find the server. So it gets you started very quickly, but there's a lot of facilities that are unique to having the server be able to access all the devices, scan the local network, and so on. And so MeshCentral 2 supports that. MeshCentral 1 never did. Another really big thing that I really wanted to do with the user experience is that MeshCentral 1, you had to hit refresh on all the pages to see the update. A lot of the pages were generated server-side and then sent as HTML to the browser. And I really wanted to go to a real-time user interface. With the advent of WebSocket, and you see it when you use most applications, Gmail, Hotmail, whatever, if an email comes in, you don't have to hit refresh to see the email. It just pops up immediately. Same for chatting, same for everything else. And so having real-time web pages was absolutely a must. Also, MeshCentral 2 and MeshCentral 1 have to deal with real-time traffic for remote desktop, for files, for remote terminal. So really, it didn't really make any sense to have real-time traffic handling for those usages, but the control data would be RESTful, wouldn't be event-driven. And so really having everything over WebSocket totally made sense, and it just makes a much better user experience. MeshCentral 1 required that you put it on an external IP address, which was really annoying. The MeshCentral 2, you can still do that, but it has reverse proxy support. So now you can have MeshCentral 2 co-located with other services, with other Docker containers, and it will work just fine. The Mesh 1 had SQL schema, which was really a pain when you're dealing with a database that has a whole bunch of stored procedures, it has a bunch of tables, those are all fixed. Then when you want to update or change something, it was just a really big ordeal to switch the schema. MeshCentral 2 completely schemaless, super easy to make changes and to keep evolving the features of MeshCentral. You're basically never breaking anything. The MeshCentral 1 had binary protocol between the agent and the server, especially, but also between the browser and the server, just made it very complicated to make changes. Now we have everything is JSON over WebSocket, super, super easy to deal with. The MeshCentral 1 used mutual authenticated TLS. I won't go into the details of that, but that really is the key to why it could never support reverse proxies. And so MeshCentral 2 uses server authenticated TLS, which is what browsers use all the time. So when you land on a web page, you see the little padlock. The agent basically, the agent on MeshCentral 2 looks like a browser. It uses WebSocket. It authenticates the server a lot the same way. And so you get all the agent connections on MeshCentral 2 through port 443, because everything comes through port 443. Very simple. With MeshCentral 1, you need a separate port to handle the binary traffic of the agent. And so that broke a whole bunch of corporate proxies and things like that. So that was just terrible. And lastly, MeshCentral 1 didn't run on Docker. So a lot of the infrastructure for the web on the back end is run on Docker containers, Kubernetes, things like that. And so it's super important that you be able to run in these environments on Docker containers. MeshCentral 2, of course, available on NPM and supports Docker containers. In fact, if you go on Docker Hub, there's people from the community who built MeshCentral images on Docker, and so you can go and get them as you please. So overall, the transition between MeshCentral 1 and MeshCentral 2, it's been, a huge recode. It's taken basically almost 2 years between, the decision to kind of stop updating MeshCentral 1 and then switching over to MeshCentral 2. And so very early users will have known both solutions, but most users will have never known the old one, and that is a really good thing. So anyway, I'm going to go back here to, view here, and just say that I'm very happy that I've transitioned from the old stack to the new stack. It's probably something that should have been done a little sooner, but it was a great time at the time to transition, and the availability of MeshCentral and NPM, the availability of the possibility of running it on Docker containers, reverse proxy support, the real-time user interface, the single programming language, all that made a huge difference to how fast we can evolve MeshCentral. So that's it. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.